Well, I am just very pleased and excited to be here with Jan Richardson, who is the author of many a book, including the book Next Step Forward in Guided Reading. She is incredibly well known. I got to actually meet and talk with her personally at the LitCon conference, and just an amazing thing there. And she's gonna I'm gonna shut up in just about 30 seconds and say, Jan, take it over. We'll start by having you tell us about yourself, and then we'll get into the questions. So Jan, take it away.
Okay. Well, my husband was a career military officer, so that offered me opportunities to live both stateside and overseas. And because of those frequent moves, I was able to teach children in every grade, kindergarten through college. That's pretty amazing to be able to have that opportunity. A major turning point in my career, though, is when I was trained as a reading recovery teacher leader at Portland State University. And after that, I trained reading recovery teachers in a large urban district just outside Washington, D.C. After earning my PhD in reading from the University of South Florida, I started writing books, consulting in schools, and speaking at conferences. And I just love that. It's just a wonderful way to spend my day and further my learning. So I spend most of my time these days either hanging out with my 6 grandkids or working shoulder to shoulder with teachers in classrooms. And I don't have any agenda except to do what's best for children.
Okay. Wonderful. And we have things in common. I've also taught every grade K through 12. Actually K through graduate school, and I have a parcel of grandchildren as well. So my goodness, small world. Now, in 2016, you wrote the best-selling book about guided reading called The Next Step Forward in Guided Reading. 7 years later, it's still popular. I'm going to be doing presentations at a couple of conferences in the next 2 weeks, and you're on that agenda both times because of the good content of that book. So let's start with how you define guided reading, and is it research-based? Okay, take it away.
So that's a really good question, Sam, and it has some current impact, because in a recent blog that Dr. Tim Shanahan did, he talked about that there are a lot of these terms in education that have no agreed upon definitions, and he actually listed guided reading as one of those generic terms. And I agree with him. Guided reading can mean different things to different people. You can have one teacher who thinks it's just reading a book with a child, and another one who actually does more systematic phonics in addition to that reading. So in my definition, I call it my next step definition. During guided reading, a teacher meets with a small group of students and differentiates instruction by targeting specific learning needs, providing appropriate scaffolding, and then gradually releasing support to promote independence. So if you look at it in the I do, we do, you do framework, guided reading is the we do part of that framework. And I really think that my definition aligns with research and reading science. And I've tried to be very clear when I talk to teachers and educators and principals that when you do guided reading, you are doing evidence-based instruction. Small group, let's just take that. Small group, there's consistent research that shows small group instruction is effective. Differentiation, I think one reason why small group instruction is effective is it gives teachers the opportunity to differentiate instruction based on their student needs. So really, it doesn't matter what reading program you use. It doesn't matter how good you are as a teacher. There will always be children in your classroom who either already know what you're teaching or aren't ready to learn what you're teaching. And guided reading gives you that opportunity to meet those needs. One of my favorite sayings is, children will learn what we teach them if we teach them what they are ready to learn. And there's explicit instruction. I am very much in line with explicit instruction. I have targeted instruction in all of the key reading skills. If you look at my yellow book, there is instruction on phonemic awareness, on phonics, fluency, decoding, comprehension, vocabulary. And one area that didn't make it to the big pillars is writing. I'm a big believer that writing supports reading. It's a reciprocal process. I want to talk a little bit about text, because that has been a criticism of guided reading, and that we're not choosing challenging texts. And I think there's justification in that. Sometimes I'll go into a classroom and the text is too easy. Teachers have a tendency, they don't want to give kids something that's challenging. But in guided reading, this is the opportunity to give them a text that's moderately challenging, because we know from research that when we give a child that's a task that's moderately challenging, and we give assistance so that they can be successful, there's tremendous motivation to learn for that. There have been some criticism on the type of books that are used in guided reading. A lot of people like to associate guided reading with only leveled books, but actually in my work, I always recommend using a variety of texts. And personally, I have used my framework with decodable books, with leveled books. I've used chapters of novels, basal stories, newspaper and magazine articles, poetry. I love teaching guided reading with poetry. It's so rich with imagery and figurative language. Nonfiction is probably the children's favorite genre because it's highly motivating and it builds their background knowledge and vocabulary. I remember once doing a guided reading lesson with advanced middle school readers, and the teachers wanted me to, what kind of text you're going to use for them. So I actually went into a physics textbook and I took a page out of there and I taught a guided reading lesson with a physics textbook. So my point is, teachers can use any text for guided reading, and it shouldn't be just associated with one type of text. But we want to make sure that text is slightly challenging and that it matches your instructional focus. Oh, motivation. Let me talk a little bit about that. I feel like that's one of the sciences of reading that's Peter Afflerbach has done a great job of explaining in his book, Teaching Readers Not Reading. I feel like if we don't teach children to want to read, if we only teach them to read and we don't teach them to want to read, I don't think we're actually doing a good job. But I have found that children are motivated in a guided reading lesson. They'll say to the teacher, are you going to work with me today? They love having this, 12 inches from the teacher, being given the instruction that they need, a book that's just right for them. I think we really want teachers to understand that this is their opportunity to meet the needs of every student in their classroom.
Okay, and having been in that situation as a Title I staff developer, teaching teachers about guided reading, one of the things I kind of look for and notice is if teachers have static groups, no changes during the whole year, then what they are actually doing is modified basal. But if they are doing guided reading, there's going to be movement in kids, and I usually look for it on a quarterly basis. I'm not sure how you do it, but and that's another thing that I watch for, even with the kids I'm working with right now in a setting. Always push them up right when they're ready, and don't leave them languishing with the same books. And I love the fact that you talked about the variety of materials, that it's not just using level text, it's using a variety. So those comments all made. Let's go into the next question is, how did you come up with the next step guided reading lesson components?
Oh, that's an interesting story. I was actually a reading recovery teacher later, and that's when I first experimented with the reciprocal process of reading and writing. And of course, that was decades ago. But I realized how powerful it was to integrate reading with writing. But I have always been a strong believer in explicit phonics instruction. So when I created my lesson framework, those decades ago, I put phonics in the front seat. And I realized that I wanted to teach a lesson where children are taught reading, they're taught writing, and they're taught phonics. So there's different lesson plans that I have on my website. Some are 15 minutes, some are 20 minutes, because I understand teachers have different time constraints. But in every lesson, I usually take one book and teach a book for maybe 2 days or 3 days, depending on the length of the book. But regardless of the level or the stage or the grade level, every next step lesson has the same components. It has the reading of that challenging text. And this is where the teacher introduces that unfamiliar vocabulary. And for, emergent readers, it might be a non-decodable sight word, or it could be a word they could decode, but they don't understand its meaning. Like you're going to find words like jig, doing a jig, or sap, and they don't understand the meaning of those words. So you just look at the text and you say, what is it that these children could not decode or could not understand? And those are the words you introduce. Sometimes teachers take too much time on the introduction and they don't have enough time for children to read the books. When children are at levels like second grade and higher and they have good decoding skills, I look for those words, those vocabulary words that are not defined in the text. So if the word is in the glossary, we should not be introducing it. We should give children the opportunity to figure out those words. So if teachers kind of think about maybe limiting how much vocabulary they introduce, they'll probably save more time for the next part of the reading, which is really the heart of the guided reading. And that's where the children read the text independently, never round robin. And while they're reading it on their own, and the teacher has the opportunity now to confer. Just think of it as a reading conference. Teacher confers with individual students, and my conference could center on decoding or fluency, especially if they're emergent or early readers. If they're transitional or fluent, my conversation is probably going to be about vocabulary or comprehension. Again, guided reading is very assessment driven. We are constantly making anecdotal notes about children's reading process and then addressing them in our lessons. During the phonics component, the phonics skill will vary depending on the needs of the children, but I do have a scope and sequence in all of my books about guided reading. That's pretty well accepted, and that all of my books include that. And I use very engaging multimodal activities to teach and review skills. And then writing. After students discuss the text, I have them write with the teacher at the table. This isn't an assignment that they go back to their seats. And what we confer with might be spelling or, hearing sounds and words, but for older writers, it could be including details or writing complex sentences. But my approach is always assessment driven, based upon whatever they're reading, writing, or phonics, it's always based on their assessments.
Oh, okay. And I'm again thinking to my staff development days, teaching teachers, especially with those very youngest children, where sometimes they're still reading aloud, and how to position them so that still works out is important. And your idea of conferencing is exactly what we were using at my site. But conferences aren't like 12, 15 minutes each kind of things. They're little sit in and do things kind of things. So as teachers think about conferencing, I want to make sure they're activating the right schema.
Right.
So, and boy, it seems like we are very much on the same page on this. All right. So you've already talked about phonics. Okay. All right. Do you really teach phonics? Do the kids really get those sound symbol relation in their heads? Or are you just teaching them pictures of sight words?
Yeah.
What are you actually doing in your lessons, please?
So, I was teaching phonics when phonics wasn't cool. I've always believed that children need to know letters and sounds. They need to be able to code words, and they also need to use meaning to assist in decoding. But when I teach phonics in specific, I really believe in small group instruction rather than a whole group. I'm seeing a lot of whole group phonics lately. A lot of kids, sitting on the carpet for 30 to 40 minutes while the teacher delivers a phonics lesson. And I know, and they know, not every kid is getting what they're teaching. Actually, last year, I had the privilege of teaching first grade. I volunteered to teach a first grade classroom for 3 months because the teacher was on maternity leave and the school couldn't find a qualified sub. And it was a wonderful experience. I absolutely loved it. I went into the first grade classroom every morning and taught the reading block. And I did do a 10-minute phonics whole class lesson. But as I'm looking out at my kids, I know which ones are getting it and which ones aren't. And then, of course, I broke into my small group lesson, and that's really where kids are going to learn the phonics, is when we teach it at the developmental stage of where they're ready to learn it. So I have, like I said, a clear scope and sequence, but I use all research-based procedures. You know, for emergent and early readers, they're maybe doing some picture sorting to learn the sound to letter links. They might be doing making words or sound boxes. And then for older readers, we teach them spelling patterns using analogy charts. I try to make it very engaging. We use a lot of magnetic letters to show kids how to break words apart by syllable or by affix and root. So it's always going to review skills that they've learned and teach them new skills that they're ready to learn next, based upon, again, our phonics assessments.
Okay. And so, gosh, there actually is phonics in guided reading, isn't there? And by the way, anyone what you're talking about, you know, again, having been a former staff developer, any staff members out there that are kind of, how do I do this? Get the book, folks.
Right.
It's all there.
Very clear.
I
Yeah.
mean, really, it's the kind of book that college professors could be easily using in their courses to teach reading as well. So it's all there, just to mention that. You're talking about the writing portion of your guided reading. And again, we're birds of a feather on this, the strong link between reading and writing. But talk about the writing portion and what that might look like.
Okay, so unfortunately, not all guided reading lessons from the past or even today include writing, but I am very passionate that that the guided reading should accompany a guided writing lesson where children are scaffolded as they write at the table. I don't send them to their seat to write a retelling of the story. I want them writing at the table with the teacher, and it varies between maybe 10 minutes with emergent writers to 20 minutes with transitional and fluent writers. So this is a we do part. This is where the children are actually writing with teacher scaffolding and support. And I would say one of the effects of the pandemic has been on writing, and we don't have the skilled writers that we have had in the past. And I think that's probably because writing was so difficult to teach virtually. But during the guided writing portion, I have some tasks that I will assign the children to write about. So in emergent readers, it's always going to be a dictated sentence, because I want the children to practice the sight words that I've taught and practice writing words that have the skills that I've taught. Plus, teaching them these simple sentence structures are really helpful for your language learners, so they can develop this structure as well. And then we move into more student-generated responses, but I still guide them. I'll have them maybe write a beginning, middle, and end. They could write a character analysis, you know, how would the character feel in the beginning and how did the character feel at the end and what caused the character to change. If they're writing about a nonfiction text, they could write facts that they've learned, maybe use the glossary, index, or other text features to write about that. And even as children are moving up, they might write a critical review. They might an opinion or a thesis proof essay on the value of aquaponic farming or something like that. So there's so many suggestions for writing different kinds of responses in my yellow book. And I have to say they all align to what I've researched on the Common Core standards as well. Oh, and I also have a lot of suggestions for struggling writers, how to help them become better writers.
Okay, and I'll point out something that I always point out to my teachers when doing this kind of in-servicing, that student writing, if you're watching, is a terrific source of what sound symbol relations the kids have at the moment. And if you do a careful kid watching job of that, it's a wonderful source of information about things that you might want to help the child learn. So that said, now comes the billion-dollar question, maybe at least $1 million question, and that is, overall, Tell us about how guided reading promotes comprehension and the creation of lifelong readers. Readers who
Yes.
really actually understand, that they're not just saying things, they're actually understanding and can talk about what they and write about what they've read, and they want to do it. So tell us
Mhm.
about that for a moment.
Well, and I believe that comprehension should be a focus of guided reading from the very beginning. It might just be retelling, what the child did in the story at the very beginning. And then, of course, as children progress, as readers, our comprehension skills become more sophisticated. But I'm glad you brought that out, because if you were to parse out my book, my yellow book, and I've never done this, but I know for a fact there's more on comprehension than there is on the decoding, because this book is appropriate for kindergarten through 8th grade. So especially in my chapter 7, I've identified 12 of the big comprehension strategies according to Common Core standards and state standards and research. What are the things that children need to develop to become good comprehenders? And then I actually have very explicit lessons, we call them modules, that teachers can either teach whole class when they're wanting to do the I do modeling, or in guided reading, so that there's specific steps that we can provide teachers, really, so that they can help children develop the skills they need. For example, comprehension monitoring is the very first module. And that's because if children aren't aware that they don't understand what they're reading, they're not going to be good at comprehending. And this could be true in the emergent readers. I went to a kindergarten class one time where the parent was there, and she said, my child can read the Bible, and I'm like, I'm really glad your child can read the Bible, but can your child understand the Bible? So just reading and decoding doesn't mean there's going to be understanding and comprehending. So I see that comprehension is a very important factor all the way through, but especially when children are getting up into grades 3, 4, 5, 6, they're having to take standardized tests. It's really mostly about comprehension at that level, but it's just not modeling. I believe in modeling, but I don't believe children learn just by modeling. I think they have to have that scaffolding, and that's where the comprehension instruction comes into play in a guided reading lesson. It's very difficult to scaffold comprehension in a whole group, very hard. But when you're in a small group, and I've gathered these kids together because they really need to learn more literal understanding. They got to learn what's the text says, or maybe they're there because they really need to work on more inferential thinking, making inferences from characters, those kinds of things. Or maybe they're there because they need to learn how to evaluate a text. So whatever it is I choose, the module I choose, there's always these steps that are going to bring children to the independence that they need. And once we teach them that, then of course, we move on to another skill or strategy that the children need to learn to develop those comprehension skills. And writing, like you said, is a very important part. There is a lot of research that shows that writing will accelerate reading. It does support comprehension. It supports phonics as well. It's a great tool for transferring phonics instruction, but really helping kids understand what they've read is to guide them into writing about what they've read.
Hey, and to kind of, whoops, I hit the wrong button. That's not good. Wait a minute, share screen. No, that's not what I want to do. Oh my. I do this with my kids too. I'm like, oh, what am I doing on the computer? I got it right now. Here we are. So I want to have one little important nuance of what you just said about comprehension, and that is Nell Duke, among others, has decades of research saying that when you teach comprehension strategies using gradual release, it can have a tremendous impact on reading scores. And that's
Absolutely.
not something you can do in 5 minutes.
Right.
So just pointing out that not only are you research based, but you're following what I think is some of the very, very best research out there around comprehension. And that's Duke and her finding that teaching strategies through gradual release has an impact. And of course, teachers, this book is gold in terms of having all the information you need on the specific ways to do that. Okay, Final question here. Yeah,
Mm.
we know that guided reading's been widely criticized recently. Why do you think that is, and what might you just your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it really hurts my soul when I hear guided reading being criticized, because I think it stems from confusions, misunderstandings, and probably what Dr. Shanahan referenced, there's not this shared definition. So it's possible that somebody saw a guided reading lesson that really wasn't very effective. And maybe they saw a teacher telling a child to guess at a word, which of course I would never have a child guess at a word, and no teacher should ever have a child guess at a word. I'm not really sure why the criticism is there, except that they don't understand it. And if they would look at my definition and understand the components and the research-based elements, I think there would be less criticism. I think another factor is, like I think you mentioned, is some teachers don't change those groupings, and they should not look like the basal groupings of years past. In fact, I can say this with honesty. Whenever I go into a classroom and I teach a guided reading lesson with students, I would say probably 75% of the time, I'll make a comment about, I think this child maybe needs to move into a different group. So we tend to try to group kids solely on their level, and I don't agree with that. We should look at a variety of factors and assessments, and especially when children are intermediate readers, I'm going to group them more on their comprehension needs than just their decoding needs. So I think they misunderstand the value of flexible grouping. They don't see how it's based upon student assessments and that we're assessment driven, and they don't see how much scaffolding and differentiation is possible. And I hope if we can get the message out what guided reading really is, and maybe we'll have to change the word. You know, if people are so obsessed with the word guided reading, and what could be wrong with that term? Guided reading sounds perfect to me. I needed guided instruction to learn how to play golf and to learn how to drive a car. I mean, there's nothing wrong with guided, and there's nothing wrong with reading. So I don't understand some of the criticisms, but I'm hoping if we get the message out of what guided reading really looks like, that there will be less criticism of it, and maybe we can find some common ground.
Okay. And talking about finding common ground, and I have to hit the right button again. Come on. There we go. Talking about common ground is near and dear to my heart, and that's a whole nother interview. Okay. But I do think that those who are going to look at what actually goes on and look at a good model, not a straw man model of guided reading, and look at the tremendous number of phonics and the scaffolded comprehension, and look at all the practices that are contained in your book, I think they will be duly impressed. And we may not get the peoples from the extremes, but I think the people in the middle are going to have a lot to gain and a lot to look at and find a lot of common ground in your work. So that all said, this is your last chance. Any final thoughts before we move out?
You know, I'm a veteran of the reading words, like you, Sam. We're veterans. And I have been through this before, but I have never experienced such animosity and vicious attacks. I've never seen that before. And it breaks my heart to see that. I go back to the Science of Reading Defining Guide, and I love sharing this quote with people. It's on page 31. And they say that in order to be good citizens of a science and practice community, we have to be willing to debate. We have to be open to debate. And then they said that educators should fairly evaluate all evidence, regardless of whether the conclusions are consistent with their beliefs. Now, that's not Jan talking. That's the Science of Reading talking. It also says that we can acknowledge differences and discuss them with respect and decency. I want to see that. Unfortunately, I'm not always seeing that on social media, but I'm hoping that as we focus on the essentials of effective reading instruction, and we find that common ground on the essentials, that when we disagree on those that are not essential, that we disagree with respect and professionalism. And that's my final word.
And what a terrific final word. Okay, now the final thing in any Bomberito interview is always the famous or infamous Zoom wave goodbye, because we are on Zoom. So if you could just give me a nice warm Zoom wave goodbye, and thank you so much. This has been so informative. And
Thank you so much.
goodbye.
Bye.